Imagine being a princess, the king's daughter, surrounded by luxury and living at the height of power. The world at your feet, a future full of possibilities and promises. But what if, in a single moment of disdain, all of that was taken from you? And worse, the very God who gave you everything abandons you? This is the story of Mikal, wife of the great King David, a woman who had it all but lost divine blessing for failing to understand the true meaning of worship. How did a princess at the heart of Israel become a cursed woman, childless and without God's grace? What happened between her and the man chosen by God to rule Israel? Prepare to uncover a tale of royalty, pride, and faith, where spiritual betrayal led to consequences that still resonate today. What would you do if, like Mikal, you lost everything over a single moment of scorn? Let's delve into this fascinating story that reveals far more than just a biblical narrative. Mikal was the daughter of Saul, the first king of Israel. She grew up in a magnificent palace, enjoying all the privileges of princess, surrounded by luxury and power. Yet, despite her royal status, Mikal was part of an empire that was crumbling. King Saul, once chosen by God to rule Israel, had already lost divine favor due to his disobedience. And Mikal, the daughter of a king rejected by God, was about to experience something even more profound, the loss of the divine blessing that by right should have been hers as a wife of a man anointed by the Lord. When David entered Mikal's life, he was just a young shepherd with no great promise or social standing. But after defeating the giant Goliath, David became Israel's national hero. His fame grew rapidly, and Mikal, the princess, found herself drawn to him, unlike her father, who despised David and sought to kill him. Mikal fell in love with this simple man who possessed a profound heart and unshakable faith in God. She did not hesitate to help him escape Saul's grasp, defy her own father to stand by David, the man chosen by God. Mikal's destiny was tied to David's future, and their love seemed full of promise. When David finally sits on the throne of Israel, his life undergoes a radical transformation. From a simple shepherd, he now finds himself ruling an empire, celebrated for his victories and conquests, with lands and riches accumulating at his feet. The young man who once faced giants now commands an entire nation, and his glory spreads throughout the kingdom. But with power comes tension. The responsibilities and challenges of governing God's people begin to consume his life. With each battle won, with each triumph that elevates his name, David drifts further from the man Mikal once knew and loved. King David, now immersed in his duties and divine missions, seems distant from everything he once cherished. The simple and vulnerable man with whom Mikal shared her dreams has become an absent king, absorbed by his obligations and the relentless wars for the survival of his kingdom. Mikal, who once loved David passionately, begins to feel the growing emptiness between them. The love she felt for him now intertwines with a sense of abandonment. She watches her husband become increasingly entangled in the grandeur of his reign, and less concerned with the woman who was once his companion and confidant. And so, the distance becomes not only physical but emotional, as David is swept away by his divine mission, while Mikal wanders through the cold and lonely corridors of her palace, unsure of how to deal with the man he has become. Mikal's life takes an unexpected turn when David, now king, decides to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This was not merely a political or symbolic act. The Ark represented God's very presence among the people of Israel. It was more than an object of worship. It was a symbol of divine covenant, power, and the Lord's protection over his nation. The return of the Ark was meant to be a grand event, a moment of celebration and joy for all of Israel. But what happened that day was something no one could have foreseen. David, in an act of deep humility and devotion, give himself completely to worship. He does not care about the weight of his crown or the expectations placed upon a king's shoulders. In that moment, he forgets royal conventions and the dignity his status demands, throwing himself into a frenzied and sincere dance, celebrating with all his heart the living presence of God among the people. He no longer sees himself as a king or ruler, but as a servant before his Lord. Every movement of his dance is a pure expression of worship, a moment in which David humbles himself before God, without concern for what others think. For him, that moment of celebration was more important than any honor, applause, or worldly recognition. It was total surrender, a broken heart, and a faith that expressed itself through gestures of pure devotion. David was not merely celebrating victory or the return of the ark. He was, in truth, yielding to God's sovereignty, demonstrating that above all human power, he saw himself as nothing more than a humble worshiper before his Creator. As David danced, Mikal watched from her palace window, far from the celebration, distant from the people and the fervor that filled the streets of Jerusalem. From her elevated position, she saw the king, her husband, giving himself over to worship in a way she had never imagined. The man to whom she had been promised now stood before the people as a common man, without royal robes, without the pride of nobility, stripping himself of his monarchic dignity and surrendering to what she perceived as a public display of weakness. What she saw was not a king yielding to the presence of God, but a man humiliating himself, losing everything she believed should be preserved. Mikal, the daughter of Saul, raised in a world where royalty was a symbol of power, authority, and honor, could not understand the gesture. She did not see David's sincere devotion, the surrender of a humble and submissive heart to God. She did not recognize the depth of his worship, but instead saw only what seemed to be the breaking of his image as king, a king lowering himself before all. To her, such behavior was unworthy, not only of monarch, but the man she had shared her life with. Contempt and judgment overtook Mikal's heart, as if David's loss of grandeur and power was also the loss of her own identity. She failed to see David's humility, did not comprehend the depth of his act of worship, and this wounded her. Instead of feeling pride in her husband, she felt shame, as if royal dignity itself was being dishonored. David did not care about the gazes of the court. He cared only about worshiping God. But Mikal could not see that. She saw only a weak man, humiliating himself before everyone, and this consumed her with a sense of disdain. When David returned to the palace, Mikal did not hold back her criticism. Without hesitation, she confronted him with cold and harsh words. How the king of Israel distinguished himself today, exposing himself before the servant girls of his servants, like some vulgar fellow. Her words were more than mere criticism. They were judgment, an accusation against David, as if he had committed an unforgivable mistake. She could not understand the purity of his worship and, in her arrogance, rejected what should have been an expression of faith and devotion. When David arrives home, Mikal, still critical, confronts him. She calls him despicable, questioning his behavior before the people and the servant women, implying that it acted like one of the villains he had once defeated. What Mikal did not realize was that, in that moment, she was scorning true worship of God, the sacred humility of Israel's king before his Creator. David, with calmness, replies, "It was before the Lord, who chose me instead of your father and his entire house, that I danced." He felt no shame in humbling himself before God. On the contrary, he took pride in it. He goes on to say that, yes, he would humble himself even more if necessary to honor the Lord. However, Mikal's disdain did not go without consequence. The Bible reveals that because of her attitude, Mikal was cursed by God. She had no children until the day of her death. Her barrenness was more than a physical condition. It was a sign that she had lost divine blessing, for she had rejected a sacred moment of worship and humility before God. In a society where bearing children was considered a great blessing and part of God's divine plan, Mikal was deprived of this grace. She lost not only the possibility of motherhood, but also her connection to God's favor, which flows through humble and obedient hearts. Mikal's story is a powerful warning to all of us. Often, we may look at something that, in God's eyes, is an expression of humility and worship, yet reject it without understanding its true value. Mikal had everything many desire: status, wealth, power, and a husband anointed by God. However, by despising true worship and humility before the Lord, she lost it all, including divine blessing. Her story teaches us that God's blessings do not come through appearances or status, but through a heart willing to humble itself before Him and live according to His will. Mikal had the chance to live a life full of grace and blessings, but rejected it when she looked with scorn upon a man who worshiped God with all his heart. Her story serves as a reminder that we must never lose sight of true worship and humility before our Creator, even when the world around us encourages us to chase status, power, and recognition. Because, as Mikal learned the hardest way, God's blessings cannot be bought with power or prestige. They come from a broken and surrendered heart before Him. If this story has touched you and made you reflect on what Mikal lost by failing to understand true worship, imagine the power that humility before God can bring to your life. Mikal's journey teaches us something valuable. God's blessings do not come from what the world offers, but from how we position ourselves before the Lord. So, if you want to keep exploring profound biblical stories and uncover lessons that can transform your life, subscribe to our channel. Don't miss any of these powerful revelations waiting for you. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated on new videos, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we will walk in faith, knowledge, and reflection. See you in the next video.